Spider-Man 3 is once again directed by Sam Raimi, and it brings back everybody from the first two, along with a lot of new faces. This tells the story of Peter Parker after the events of Spider-Man 2. He's happy, he's living his best life, he's got the girl, and the city loves him, but then his relationship with Harry starts to kind of fall through a little bit more, and then you get the emergence of Sandman, and then you get the emergence of this black goo that is a symbiote, which then takes hold of Peter Parker's life, and then it turns into a whole fiasco, and oh boy, is this movie not as good as the first two. Now, one thing that this movie has like a reputation of is obviously it does have the memes that everybody really loves on right now with the whole bully Maguire and that sort of thing, which they are funny and it is warranted in some cases. However, the stigma of this movie is that it's a bad movie, and yes, in many cases this is a bad movie. It does have bad traits, but I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say it's a bad movie. I've seen worse movies in my lifetime, and while this movie has a lot of excess stuff, I've heard it before in a phrase that's like, you have to peel away the fat to kind of get to the good stuff. Like, there is good stuff in the heart and soul of this movie, and unfortunately, due to studio interference and creative, differences from the director, we get this piece of hot garbage. So right off the bat, we get Peter Parker going to MJ's play, enjoying life as it is. And then once we get past that, we kind of see Harry. There's a little bit of a confrontation there. And then they kind of speed along from them on the date and seeing the play to a criminal running in the street, which then we find out is Flint Marko running from the cops because he's trying to get money for his sick daughter. Now, I don't think Sandman is really bad in this movie. I think that Thomas Haden Church really brings it in this. Like, he's not awful in the movie. It's just he's under some bad circumstances in the way that he's fighting for screen time in the script more so, and it only limits your performance in many ways. And then we also see when Peter Parker goes on a date with Mary Jane, there's a meteor that hits the Earth, and there's this black ooze that comes out, which then sets up the symbiote that comes back later in the movie. And even before all this, too, we get Harry Osborn going and using the Goblin Serum, and it's just, when you look at the movie and you see these notes and you see, like, how it just plays out, you already see that this has got a lot going for it, and it's a 2-hour and 20-minute movie, and how are they going to cram all this stuff? Because in the beginning of this movie, in, like, the first 15 minutes of this movie, you've now seen Harry Osborn is going to be a villain because he's using the Goblin tech. You see this criminal has to be some sort of major plot point if you didn't know he was going to be Sandman in the movie. And you see this black goo that you are not sure exactly what it is, and that's going to hinder probably Spider-Man as well. So it's like, when you first see it, it becomes really jarring, and it becomes like, oh boy, we're in for a really bumpy ride. This then leads to Peter going back and seeing Aunt May, and then he pops the question in a way, being like, I'm going to ask MJ to marry me, and this then leads to the first fight with Harry Osborn and Peter Parker, which, it's a pretty ugly fight, and this is a common trait that happens throughout the entire movie, is that there are some pretty ugly fights in this one, and it's mostly just because they do completely CGI'd faces and stuff like that. But however, the one thing that keeps it interesting in this movie, or in this entire fight actually, is the ring that Peter Parker has in his possession. There's some great moments in there where it's like he drops the ring and he has to get it. So it keeps you, it gives your attention, like you kind of grasp it and you're like, okay, there's some sort of stakes here. But then you get some really crappy green screen when they go down the alley, and then there's just even more bad CGI, and then it just kind of ends with Harry, getting hit on the head a couple times and going to the hospital and forgetting his memory, which is one of the worst things you can do in a movie. Like, the villain forgetting his memory, even though he's like tied to the main character in a big way, that is just, that's a bad misstep in this screenplay. That is a horrible misstep. Which then leads to, then we see, Flint Marko then on the run again from the cops, and then this is where we get, the birth of Sandman in a way. And I do have to say, in this scene, Flint Marko falls down this pit after he crawls over the fence for like this laboratory place, right? And he falls in this pit with a bunch of sand, and then the doctor is like, oh, there's been a, difference in mass in the creation. And then the guy just goes, it's a bird, it'll probably fly out there. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, okay, so there's obviously a difference in mass in the, the tunnel, right? Do they know specifically how much mass? Because they should probably look at that and go, that's not the weight of a bird whatsoever. That is much more than what a bird is. Because if it was a bird, it'd probably be like a little bit. But this is a whole ass dude just falled in this tunnel. And then he turns into the Sandman. And I will have to say that the birth of the Sandman with the visual storytelling where he's trying to grab the locket of his daughter and really trying to bring himself up, after these events, it is really, really good. This is one of the few things in this movie that is just pinpoint accurate, really good stuff to see. But then we also get Mary Jane Watson being Mary Jane Watson in the way that she's being a bitch, basically. Like, she ends up reading reviews from critics, and then Peter's like, come on, it's okay, kind of get back on the horse, it's all right. And MJ's just, like, pissed at him for, like, trying to be supportive in a way, because Peter is a nice guy, I guess. So, once again, this just proves that Mary Jane Watson in this trilogy specifically is not the greatest depiction ever, because I would never read a comic and think that, oh yeah, the hero should go for the bitchy girl that he might like over like somebody that's like not gonna complain as much. Then we get a crane sequence where this basically just introduces this is supposed to introduce Eddie Brock and Gwen Stacy in this, where Peter flies out of the apartment and he goes and saves Gwen Stacy from falling off the rafters as Eddie Brock is taking photos of him. Now this sets up a rivalry with him and Peter Parker at the Daily Bugle. And once again, we introduce another villain in this. So not only do we have Sandman Harry and all those before, we also now have Eddie Brock. And if you know anything from the comics, he becomes something later on, which then is just like, what the hell were they thinking? Like, they could have just stuck with maybe 1 to 2 villains, and then that would have been it. And they also introduced this Gwen Stacy character specifically because there needs to be another love triangle in this fucking movie with already enough stuff going on. Like, I don't need to see a Peter Parker, Mary Jane, and Gwen Stacy fucking love triangle. We've already established these characters to be like, this is the couple, and then this is what they do. I didn't need to see this more, and that's only because they feared that Kirsten Dunst wasn't going to come back for the 4th one, which never ended up happening then. This then leads to the following couple days, where then they have the celebration of the key ceremony for Peter Parker, and then Peter Parker grabs the cane, which again progresses the plot of the love triangle, because then he kisses Gwen Stacy on stage. But then this also shows the first fight that Peter Parker is going to have as Spider-Man with Sandman, because the cops decide to try to actually find him for once and do something about it. And the cop tries to like stab like this sand thing in the street, like a car full of sand, and it's just the funniest thing ever. But then Sandman runs away. He tries to steal money from a bank car. Peter Parker goes there. There's a nice little fun sequence there that I kind of liked, with Peter kind of saving and then they. And there's a really funny line of like, where do all these guys come from, as he's like pouring out the sand from his boot. That was pretty funny stuff. So again, another decent scene in this movie, followed by another great scene with the diner scene that is probably one of the better ones in the Spider-Man trilogy, where Bruce Campbell makes another appearance in a fantastic role as like the French, hostess of this restaurant. And like, he just snaps and like pushes people away after Peter accidentally calls him a couple times to bring the wine and it's not ready yet. And there's some really good stuff in here with Peter and MJ just kind of having a bit of an argument again, as far as like, you're not there for me, and like, I don't care how you're stating things. This isn't, you're not supporting me in the way that I think you should be, which then leads to Peter Parker just being upset and running out of the restaurant. But if there wasn't enough going on in this movie, you do find out that Flint Marko was the guy who actually killed Uncle Ben. So now you have even more of a reason to really have Flint there. But it was just hampered in a lot of different ways, because then the next scene that you get after that is you get Peter kind of pacing in his room after he hears that, and then he ends up falling asleep in his bed, and this is when the symbiote finally appears. And it's like, we waited a long time to see this. Like, this falls into the movie quite a bit, and when it happens, you think like it's also grandiose moment where Peter's like, oh my god, what is this thing, and then he just swings around the buildings like for about a minute, and then nothing happens. He just goes to Dr. Connors to kind of see what it is, but he doesn't really question it after that. Like, he's just kind of like accepted, like, this is a thing now, which was very uncommon for Peter to have done, probably, if we were really trying to hone down into his character and be like, would Peter like really think like this is okay, like that there isn't something like minorly out of place. This then leads to actually one of the better things in this movie after that, is the fight sequence that the black suit Spider-Man then has with Sandman in the subway. And I really did like this. It was a lot of hard-hitting stuff. There was some emotional stuff in there. And all in all, one of the better fight scenes that they have in this trilogy. But if you thought we were done with love triangles, you are mistaken, my friend. We are not done with love triangles, because then after those events, we see Mary Jane going to Harry after he's let out from the hospital with his short-term memory loss, and he kind of goes on a bit of a date in his house. Like, they start cooking, they start dancing together, which then leads to a kiss. Mary Jane leaves, and then this is the part where Harry regains his memory in just such a like boring and like uninspired manner. Like, the guy just like kissed Mary Jane, starts drinking, and then he sees his father in the portrait again, and then he's like, Willem Dafoe's just, oh, I see now you want to remember. Now we can remember stuff again. And it's one of the worst things that you can do as far as like getting, a villain off screen for a while. I mean, they kind of had to, because they had so many villains in this movie, but just don't have that many villains in your movie in the first place. Because not only did we get all those villains in the first place, we now have the Peter Parker bad boy side, and like the alter ego of Peter Parker being warped by the suit, which then causes another fight with Harry Osborn, which I really do like, because then Harry regains his memory, tells MJ to break up with him, and then Harry reveals to Peter in a diner that he's the other guy that she falls in love with. Peter then realizes, oh, he got his memory back because he did a goblin thing and disappeared in the diner from a train or like a bus floating through. And then it leads to a bare knuckle fight that they have in the Osborn mansion, and I really, really liked it. There was some awesome play on like their past history, as far as like, Harry getting thrown through a window, and then he's like, I protected you in high school and now I'm going to kick your ass. There's some great stuff with Peter being like, your father despised you. There's a lovely line where he's like, oh, little Goblin Jr., oh, you're going to cry? Which then leads to the end of it being he blows Harry's face off almost. So this is Peter Parker. He's fully embraced the alter ego. He's now, I'm mad Peter Parker now. And then once he passes one of the newsstands, he sees that Eddie Brock had falsely accused Spider-Man in the black suit of stealing money from a bank. This then leads to him getting fired because he had photoshopped a previous photo that Peter had used in order to make it look like that he robbed the bank, which then leads to the fantastic, it is fantastic despite what you think, this leads to one of the best things in this movie this has to offer, really. So after he gets fired, he's feeling good about himself. Peter Parker finally gets the staff job for the photographer role at the Daily Bugle, and he finishes all off with a dance. So after he does his little douchebag kind of dance around, and it's great to see, we get the date between Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy going to a bar where Mary Jane is now a waitress and a singer. This then leads to a jazz number that he does where he tries to impress and embarrass MJ, which that part I didn't like, really. I like because there's theories out there that's like, this is the symbiote altering Peter's mind, thinking that this is what cool is, with his whole, finger pointing and shit like that, you know, like, that's what the suit wants him to think is cool. But the jazz number part, that's, you know, him being like, now dig on this, and he starts snapping. Ugh, it's cringeworthy, and I'm not the biggest fan. I laughed at it, don't get me wrong, but I didn't need that part specifically. But after a big scuffle he has with the security, he realizes he needs to get rid of the suit after accidentally hitting MJ. There's some pretty good symbolism in here when he goes to the church bell and he starts ripping off the suit as the church, you know, bell is ringing, but then some of it falls on Eddie Brock Jr. because he's there praying for Peter's downfall. He then gets the drop of the Venom symbiote suit, and then we get, spoilers, I just said it, Venom. So, as if we didn't have more villains in this movie. Now, throw in Venom. Just throw him in. Just be like, oh, hey, Venom's in now, and he's gonna be here for like 2 minutes. So Peter gets rid of it, and then rapid event happens. Venom just finds Sandman in the streets of New York and decides to team up to take down Spider-Man, which is so dumb. It's like, how did he find him? Like, really? Like, of all the places in New York, you found him that way? Like, that would be a tall task to do, wouldn't it? This then leads to Venom and Sandman teaming up at an old construction site. Venom then takes Mary Jane, and then it's all over the news that they want Spider-Man to show up and show that he can defeat both of them, which then leads to Peter donning the old suit, going to find Harry, and then with a decent makeup job that they have with half of his face kind of warped from the explosion, Harry doesn't want to go. He leaves, and then we get the dumbest fucking thing in the trilogy by far is Harry's butler tends to him after he like examines the destruction that is in the little goblin cave that he has, and he's just like, Harry, I cleaned your father's wounds. Blood was on the glider. He was telling the truth. He killed himself. And it was just like, you chose now to tell Harry. You chose now of all times to tell Harry that, yeah, your father did kill himself. It's not Spider-Man's fault. You chose this exact moment to do it. Get the fuck out of here, dude. So Peter shows up to the construction site. He starts fighting Sandman and Venom. He realizes that it's too much to take on with some pretty awful CGI yet again with fully rendered faces. And it's just like, if you're going to do CGI fights, cover up the faces, because that's the hardest part to really get down. And that goes for the entire movie. There's a lot of scenes in this where the faces specifically just look like shit. And if they would have just kept it where it's like Spider-Man and they just kept his mask on, it would have looked a little bit better. But then Harry shows up to save the day. They have some pretty decent shots with him kind of, you know, floating around on the Sandman, surfing on him. They save Mary Jane, and then it leads to the climax of the movie where Venom attempts to kill Peter Parker, but then Harry jumps in the way and he kills himself to save Spider-Man. Then after that, he realizes that he has to use the sound to get the Venom suit off of Eddie Brock. He does so. He throws the grenade at it. The grenade blows up Eddie Brock and Venom after he tries to jump back in to get it. And there's the end of the movie. A pretty anticlimactic finish. Again, the fights weren't too great in the end of here. There was some nice double team stuff that they did with Harry and Peter Parker. But again, it was a pretty underwhelming finale to this trilogy. Sandman then goes up to Spider-Man. He explains to him that I'm not a bad person. I didn't mean to kill your uncle. I was just trying to find money. Your uncle was trying to help me. And then the gun accidentally went off after my partner came up and told me to get moving. Peter forgives him, flies off into the sunset as sand. Then they kind of, MJ and Harry and Peter have a moment together in Harry's final moments when they're together mourning his death now. This is now, both Osborns are now dead. The Osborn legacy is now dead. And then the end of the movie is Peter Parker and MJ dancing in the middle of the bar that she is hired at. Again, it's just a hodgepodge of a mess as far as the script goes. There's too much going on in the entire script. There is some decent, camera work throughout the entire movie with some really creative shots, as I said, stating one of them being like when Harry is surfing on Sandman's arm towards the end of the movie. And then there's just some really, decent stuff all the way through. But as an overall package, like, it's a major misstep in this trilogy. And one of the finishing touches I will say that was on this trilogy that probably will not be replicated any better in any other Spider-Man movie is the themes in this trilogy were really, really good. Spider-Man's theme was really, really good. Sandman's theme was pretty halfway decent. And even the black suit Spider-Man, every time something went down and then you hear the violins and everything go, it just, there's a gravity to it. That's what it's supposed to help with. It gives some gravitas to the moment. And I will say that it is a major misstep in the trilogy. I still enjoy the movie for what it is, but it most definitely does not live up to the hype that the first two movies definitely did. I'm going to give Spider-Man 3 3 stars. Thank you guys so much for watching this review. We are now officially done with the Sam Raimi trilogy. We're going to move on to the two Amazing Spider-Man movies with Andrew Garfield as the lead. Don't know if I necessarily want to do a single review for each one or if I kind of want to put them both together, but we shall see down the road. If you enjoyed listening to me talk about some movies, you can also listen to me on other podcast forums on The Andrew Paul Show. We're going to be going over wrestling shows currently. We're going to be going over movies that I see throughout the weeks. Some more new releases and old releases mixed in there. If you want, links are down in the description for Spotify and Apple and Anchor. Thank you very much, guys, for watching, and I'll talk to y'all next time.